It was raining that night, a relentless downpour that blurred the streetlights into hazy halos, and I found myself lost in a part of town I didn't recognize. The roads twisted like a labyrinth, and my phone, useless in the storm, refused to pick up a signal. Just as panic began to creep in, I spotted a faint glow ahead, a single neon sign in crimson letters that read, "The Endless Table." The building was old, its exterior clad in weathered wood and ivy that seemed almost alive, curling and twisting as if watching me approach. My soaked clothes clung to me as I pushed open the heavy door, a bell tinkling softly to announce my arrival. Inside, the air was thick with the aroma of roasted meats and freshly baked bread, mingling with a faint metallic tang that seemed out of place. The room was cavernous, far larger than it had any right to be based on the size of the building, and at its center stretched a single, impossibly long table that seemed to recede into infinity. Every seat was occupied by diners of all ages and appearances, yet there was something off about them. Their faces were unnervingly blank, their eyes glazed as they ate in synchronized silence. A woman in a crisp black uniform approached me, her lips curling into a smile that didn't reach her cold, glassy eyes. "Welcome," she said, her voice flat and emotionless. "A seat is waiting for you." Before I could protest, she led me to a chair near the middle of the table, its surface gleaming under the dim, flickering chandeliers. A plate was already set before me, its contents hidden beneath a polished silver dome. Around me, the diners ate mechanically, their movements precise and identical, as if controlled by an unseen puppeteer. I hesitated to lift the dome, my hands trembling as an inexplicable sense of dread settled over me. When I finally mustered the courage, the sight beneath the dome made my stomach churn. A piece of meat, raw and pulsating faintly as if alive, sat atop a bed of blood-red grains that seemed to writhe like worms. "Eat," the woman whispered, her breath cold against my neck. I shook my head, but the others at the table suddenly turned to face me, their hollow eyes boring into mine. "Eat," they chanted in unison, their voices merging into a single, otherworldly hum. Reluctantly, I picked up the fork, the metal icy against my fingers, and took a bite. The taste was unlike anything I'd ever experienced. Rich, overwhelming, and disturbingly familiar. As I swallowed, memories flooded my mind. Moments I hadn't thought of in years, each one tinged with an inexplicable sorrow. With each bite, more memories surfaced, but they weren't just mine. They were fragments of lives I didn't recognize, lives filled with despair, betrayal, and death. I tried to stop, but my hands moved on their own, shoveling the food into my mouth as tears streamed down my face. The others watched silently, their faces now grotesque caricatures of human features, their mouths twisted into wide, unnatural grins. The woman returned, placing another dish before me without a word. This time, it was a severed hand, its fingers curling slightly as if in protest. I screamed, but no sound escaped my throat, and the diners erupted into guttural laughter that echoed endlessly in the vast space. My body betrayed me, picking up the hand and biting into it as if it were the most natural thing in the world. The taste was unbearable, yet I couldn't stop, couldn't resist the unseen force compelling me to consume. The room began to shift, the walls stretching and warping as the table grew longer, the diners multiplying until they filled my entire field of vision. I realized then that the table wasn't just endless. It was alive, pulsing like a massive, grotesque organ that fed on those who dared to sit at it. My reflection appeared on the surface of my plate, but it wasn't me. It was a hollow, gaunt creature with sunken eyes and a mouth smeared with blood. The woman leaned in close, her grin revealing rows of jagged, yellow teeth. "Welcome to the table," she whispered, her voice echoing in my mind. "You'll never leave." The world around me dissolved into darkness, and when I awoke, I was seated at the table again, my hands moving mechanically as I ate without thought or will. Across from me, a newcomer sat, their face pale with fear as they lifted the dome before them. I tried to scream, to warn them, but my voice was gone, replaced by the unending hum of the diners, a choir of damned souls bound forever to the endless feast. It started as a whim, a desperate attempt to salvage a dreary night in a city that seemed to snuff out all forms of joy. I was wandering aimlessly when I stumbled upon a dimly lit restaurant nestled between two decrepit buildings, its glowing red sign spelling out "Feast Eternal." There was something unsettling about it. Perhaps the way the letters flickered erratically or the faint metallic scent that seemed to emanate from within, but curiosity got the better of me. Inside, the air was thick with the scent of meat, spices, and something else I couldn't quite place, something cloying and almost sweet. The maitre d', a pale and gaunt man with sunken eyes that glinted like black pearls, greeted me with an unnerving smile. "A table for one?" I said hesitantly, and he nodded, leading me through a maze of candlelit tables filled with diners whose faces seemed oddly expressionless, their gazes fixed on their plates as if in a trance, their hands moving methodically as they consumed dish after dish without pause. My table was tucked in the far corner, where the shadows seemed to deepen unnaturally. The menu was peculiar. There were no descriptions, only names like The Awakening, The Fleshbound, and The Forgotten. Feeling a chill run down my spine, I chose the Forbidden Course, the name striking me as both ominous and oddly enticing. As I waited, I observed the diners more closely. Their skin was pale, their eyes dull and unfocused, yet their mouths moved with an unsettling vigor, gnashing and tearing at the food as if they were starving animals. The first course arrived. A small bowl of soup, crimson and steaming, its surface shimmering like oil on water. I hesitated but took a sip. The taste was indescribable, a blend of spices and something metallic, something alive. As the soup settled in my stomach, I felt a strange warmth spread through me, like tendrils of heat creeping through my veins. The second course followed swiftly. A platter of meat, its surface glistening under the candlelight, the aroma both intoxicating and repulsive. With each bite, I felt a growing unease, as if I was consuming something that shouldn't be consumed, something forbidden. The maitre d' appeared beside me, his hollow voice whispering, "The final course is ready." Before I could protest, a silver dome was placed before me. When it was lifted, I recoiled in horror. The dish was a reflection of myself. My face, contorted in agony, staring back at me from a bed of garnishes. Panic surged through me and I turned to flee, but the diners had risen from their tables, their faces now grotesque masks of hunger and malice. They closed in around me, their fingers clawing at my skin, dragging me back to the table. I screamed, but no sound came out, my voice swallowed by the oppressive air. As they forced me to consume the horrific dish, I felt my consciousness slip away, my identity dissolving into the abyss. When I awoke, I was seated at a table, my hands methodically cutting into a plate of meat, my reflection staring back at me from its glossy surface. Around me, the diners were silent, their vacant eyes mirroring my own. The maitre d' approached another newcomer, his eerie smile widening as he greeted them with the same words he had spoken to me. The cycle continued, an eternal feast where the diners became the consumed, and I was now one of them, trapped in this cursed place where the food devoured the soul, leaving nothing but an empty husk to feast forevermore. I didn't plan to stop at the restaurant, it wasn't on my route, and it wasn't supposed to exist. The road was familiar, one I'd taken countless times on late-night drives to clear my head, but this time, an unfamiliar glow caught my eye through the dense fog. The sign read, "The Feast of Shadows," its letters formed by flickering light that danced like embers. My stomach growled, betraying the hunger I hadn't noticed until that moment, and against my better judgment, I pulled into the gravel parking lot. The building was nondescript, its facade weathered and unremarkable, save for the eerie aura that seemed to cling to it like a second skin. Inside, the atmosphere was oppressive, the air heavy with a scent I couldn't place, rich and sweet, but with an undertone of decay. The lighting was dim, the walls lined with faded portraits whose eyes seemed to follow my every move. A hostess appeared seemingly out of nowhere, her face partially obscured by a veil, her voice a hollow whisper as she gestured for me to follow her. The dining room was vast, far larger than the building's exterior suggested, with tables draped in deep crimson cloth and a massive chandelier that hung low, casting fragmented light that didn't seem to reach the corners. The patrons were eerily silent, their faces pale and expressionless as they ate with mechanical precision. My seat was at a small, round table near the center of the room, and the moment I sat down, the hostess vanished, replaced by a waiter who placed a menu before me without a word. The menu was strange, blank except for a single line: "Choose wisely, for the first course is the beginning, and the last course is the end." Before I could ask what it meant, the waiter reappeared, his gaunt face devoid of emotion, and placed a covered dish before me. "Your choice has been made," he said, though I had chosen nothing. Lifting the lid, I found a plate of dark, glistening meat, its surface rippling as if alive. The sight made my stomach churn, but the hunger gnawed at me with an almost painful intensity, and before I knew it, I had taken a bite. The taste was overwhelming, sweet, salty, bitter, and sour all at once, like every flavor I had ever known distilled into a single unbearable sensation. As I swallowed, a strange numbness spread through my body, followed by a sharp, searing pain in my chest. Around me, the other diners began to change, their features warping and twisting into grotesque masks of terror and agony. One by one, they turned to face me, their hollow eyes filled with accusation, their mouths opening wide in silent screams. The waiter returned with the second course, a bowl of soup so dark it seemed to absorb the light around it. Reluctantly, I drank, and with each sip, memories that weren't mine flooded my mind. Scenes of violence, betrayal, and despair that left me gasping for air. I tried to stand, to leave, but my body refused to obey, my limbs heavy as stone. The waiter smiled for the first time, a twisted grin that revealed rows of jagged, blackened teeth. "The feast must continue," he said, and the room seemed to shudder at his words. The third course arrived, a grotesque amalgamation of flesh and bone that pulsed with a sickening rhythm. The diners began to chant in low, guttural tones, their voices blending into a haunting melody that made my skin crawl. As I ate, I felt myself slipping away, my thoughts unraveling like threads pulled from a fraying tapestry. My reflection in the polished silver plate stared back at me, but it wasn't my face. It was something darker, something monstrous. The walls of the restaurant began to close in, the portraits on the walls coming to life, their eyes bleeding as they wept crimson tears. The chandelier above me swayed violently, its glass shards raining down like daggers. The final course was placed before me, a single beating heart that pulsed with a rhythm that matched my own. "Eat," the waiter commanded, his voice echoing like thunder. I tried to resist, but my hands moved on their own, lifting the heart to my lips. The moment I took a bite, the room erupted into chaos. The diners screamed, their bodies collapsing into heaps of ash as the walls cracked and splintered, revealing an infinite void beyond. The waiter and hostess stood side by side, their faces now blank slates as they watched me with lifeless eyes. "You are the feast," they said in unison, their voices merging into a single, deafening roar. The floor gave way beneath me, and I fell into the void, my body dissolving into nothingness as the restaurant disappeared, leaving only the echo of the diners' screams and the haunting melody of their chant. When I awoke, I was seated at a new table in a different restaurant, the menu before me blank except for a single line: "Choose wisely, for the feast never ends." I shouldn't have stopped, but the storm had made the road ahead impossible to see, and my fuel gauge teetered on empty. The place appeared out of nowhere, a squat, brick building with an ancient sign reading "The Whispering Fork," swinging ominously in the rain. It wasn't on any map I'd ever seen, and the thought crossed my mind to keep driving, but the wind howled like a banshee, and I couldn't ignore the prickling sense of urgency clawing at my mind. As I entered, the door creaked open with an almost human groan, and the scent of stale grease and rotting would hit me like a wave. Inside, the restaurant was dim, lit by sconces that flickered faintly, their bulbs seemingly alive with their own failing pulses. The few patrons scattered at mismatched tables didn't acknowledge me, their faces obscured by shadow or turned just slightly away, as though they were painted figures trapped in a grotesque tableau. I hesitated, heart pounding, before a frail hostess materialized from the gloom. Her pale face so gaunt it seemed to belong to a skull. "One for dinner?" she asked, her voice thin and rasping, and before I could reply, she gestured for me to follow her to a booth in the back corner. The seat was sticky, the upholstery cracked, and the table was uneven, its surface scarred by what looked like deep claw marks. The menu was bizarre. No words, just an illustration of an old man with hollow eyes and skeletal hands holding a fork. As I flipped the laminated sheet over, the illustration changed. The man was closer now, the fork almost at my face. I slammed the menu down, unnerved, just as a waiter emerged from the shadows, his form impossibly tall, his face a void of featureless skin. He placed a single glass of murky water before me, and without asking said, "Your meal will begin soon." I tried to speak, to protest, but my voice caught in my throat like a swallowed razor. Around me, the patrons began to shift, their movements jerky and unnatural, like marionettes controlled by an unskilled hand. I could hear faint whispers emanating from nowhere, words I couldn't understand but which pressed against my skull like a growing pressure. My meal arrived without ceremony. A plate of something unrecognizable, steaming and writhing as if alive. The smell was unbearable, a rancid blend of decay and sulfur, but my hunger gnawed at me like an animal trapped in a cage. I took a tentative bite, and the taste was indescribable, a chaotic blend of every flavor imaginable, as though it were meant to overwhelm my senses and drown me in its complexity. With each bite, the whispers grew louder, clearer, until I could discern voices calling my name, accusing, mocking, and laughing in a language only my subconscious seemed to understand. I glanced at the other diners, but their eyes were fixed on me now, glowing faintly in the dim light, their mouths stretched into silent screams. The waiter returned, his towering form seeming to loom impossibly larger, and placed another dish before me. A raw, glistening organ that beat faintly, as though it were still alive. I pushed it away, while rising in my throat, but the whispers turned to shrieks, the room vibrating with the intensity of their anger. My hands moved on their own, trembling as they picked up the fork and plunged it into the flesh. Blood spurted out, hot and sticky, covering my hands as the whispers morphed into a chant, rhythmic and deafening. The walls began to pulse like living tissue, their texture no longer wood or plaster but something organic, something alive. I tried to stand, to run, but the floor seemed to grip my feet like quicksand, and the other patrons rose from their seats in unison, their faces now grotesque masks of bone and sinew, their mouths opening wider than humanly possible. "You're part of the feast now," one of them rasped, their voice an unnatural harmony of dozens, and suddenly I realized they were all staring at the booth behind me. Slowly, I turned, and my blood turned to ice. The old man from the menu illustration sat there, grinning with his hollow eyes, his fork raised in a skeletal hand. He beckoned me with a slow, deliberate motion, and as I tried to scream, I felt the fork in my own hand move again, plunging toward my chest as though it had a will of its own. The whispers erupted into a cacophony of laughter as my vision blurred, the edges of the room dissolving into darkness. The last thing I saw before the blackness consumed me was the old man's skeletal grin, wider than before, as he whispered, "The fork chooses its master, and now you will feed the hunger." When I woke, I was seated at a new table in a restaurant I didn't recognize, the menu before me showing the same hollow-eyed man, but now he looked like me. The first line of the menu read, "Welcome to the Whispering Fork. Your feast begins now." The rain poured down in torrents, drumming relentlessly on my car roof as I squinted through the windshield, the wipers futile against the sheets of water obscuring my vision. I had been lost for over an hour on a desolate country road, my GPS spinning uselessly, and just as the needle of my fuel gauge dipped into the red, I spotted the faint glow of neon in the distance. The sign read, "The Eternal Feast," in flickering red letters that seemed to drip like blood, though I dismissed it as a trick of the light. Relieved, I pulled into the gravel lot, my tires crunching over stones slick with rain, and stepped into the night. The building was small and unassuming, yet something about it felt profoundly wrong. A sensation I couldn't quite place but which settled deep in my gut like lead. Pushing open the heavy oak door, I was immediately engulfed by warmth and the mingling aromas of roasted meat, baked bread, and something far less identifiable, something metallic and sour that lingered just beneath the surface. The dining room was dimly lit, its walls adorned with faded wallpaper depicting lush, overflowing cornucopias, the fruits and vegetables almost too lifelike, as though frozen in time rather than painted. Round tables covered in white linen dotted the room, and though the restaurant appeared empty, I felt eyes on me, a crawling sensation at the back of my neck. A woman appeared seemingly from nowhere, her sudden presence startling me. She wore an old-fashioned uniform, her face pale and doll-like, her eyes wide but utterly devoid of warmth. "A table for one?" she asked, her voice flat and without inflection. Nodding hesitantly, I followed her through the maze of empty tables to a secluded corner where the flickering candlelight barely reached. As she handed me a menu, I noticed her hands were too smooth, the skin almost waxen, as if sculpted rather than natural. The menu was strange. No prices, no descriptions, only a single line of text beneath the heading, "Eat what you desire, but beware the consequence." The words seemed to shimmer, and as I stared at them, the letters rearranged themselves into something incomprehensible, ancient symbols that burned in my mind when I blinked. The waitress had vanished, leaving me alone with the unnerving silence that pressed in from all sides. I looked around the room, searching for any other patrons, but the space was empty, the shadows in the corners unnaturally thick and alive with faint, rhythmic movements. Before I could make sense of it, a plate was placed before me, though I hadn't ordered. The dish was beautiful in its presentation, something dark and rich, steam rising in fragrant tendrils. But the longer I looked, the more it seemed to writhe, the meat pulsating faintly as though it had just been cut from a living thing. Against my better judgment, I took a bite, the flavor overwhelming, a perfect balance of sweet, savory, and something deeply alien, a taste I could neither name nor forget. It was only after the first bite that I realized the dining room was no longer empty. Figures had appeared at the tables around me, their faces obscured by shadow despite the flickering light. Their presence was wrong, their movements disjointed, their heads tilting and twitching in unnatural rhythms as though struggling to mimic human behavior. One figure turned toward me, and I nearly choked at the sight of its face, or what should have been its face. The features were a shifting void, a dark expanse where eyes, nose, and mouth should have been, but it was looking at me, of that I was certain. Panicking, I pushed back my chair and stood, only to find that the room had changed. The exit was gone, the walls now closer, pulsating like the inside of a living organism. The figures at the other tables began to rise in unison, their movements jerky and marionette-like, and as they advanced toward me, I stumbled backward, bumping into the table and spilling my drink. The liquid spread across the tablecloth, but it wasn't wine or water. It was thick, black, and seemed to absorb the candlelight. I turned to run, but my path was blocked by the waitress, her once doll-like face now grotesque, the skin stretched too tightly over an angular skull, her smile splitting impossibly wide to reveal rows of needle-like teeth. "The feast has begun," she hissed, her voice layered with countless others, some whispering, some screaming, all speaking at once. The patrons closed in, their featureless faces now mere inches from mine, and as they touched me, I felt a coldness that pierced to the bone, a suffocating weight that dragged me down into the chair. The plate before me had changed, the food now unrecognizable, a heap of raw, glistening organs that pulsed faintly. My hands moved of their own accord, the fork and knife slicing into the flesh as the figures around me chanted in that same layered cacophony. With each bite, the walls drew closer, the ceiling lowering until it pressed against my head, and the air grew thick and metallic, filling my lungs with every breath. My vision blurred, the room spinning as the faces melted into the walls, their mouths now part of the pulsating wallpaper, whispering secrets that clawed at my sanity. Just as I thought I would suffocate, everything stopped. I awoke seated at the same table, but the restaurant was gone, replaced by an endless expanse of darkness. The table floating in a void lit only by the faint glow of the plate before me. A single voice echoed in the silence, low and resonant, speaking directly into my mind. "You are the feast now." As the plate began to rise, the void came alive with countless glowing eyes, the same featureless patrons now circling, their laughter a twisted symphony of despair. I screamed, but no sound came, and as the darkness closed in, I realized I was no longer the diner. I was the meal. The rain hammered down relentlessly as I pulled into the gravel parking lot of a decrepit restaurant that seemed to materialize out of the fog, its dimly lit sign reading "Crimson Appetite" in jagged letters that pulsed faintly, as though alive. I had been driving aimlessly for hours, escaping the suffocating monotony of my life and the gnawing emptiness that had settled in my chest for weeks. Hunger clawed at my stomach, an insistent ache that made this grim establishment seem oddly inviting despite its sinister appearance. The building itself looked ancient, its wooden exterior warped and cracked, the windows fogged with condensation that distorted the dim interior light. Pushing open the heavy, splintered door, I was met with a strange warmth, the air thick with the smell of roasting meat and something acrid, like burnt hair. The dining room was eerily quiet, the faint hum of flickering light bulbs the only sound, and though the room was filled with tables, not a single other patron was in sight. It felt like stepping into a time capsule, a world where the clock had stopped ticking long ago, trapping everything in a liminal state of decay. I hesitated, but a figure emerged from the shadows before I could turn back. A tall man dressed in a crimson waistcoat, his face pale and gaunt, his eyes sunken yet glinting with a strange, predatory light. "Welcome," he said, his voice smooth yet hollow, like wind whispering through a crypt. "A table for one, I presume?" Too weary to argue, I nodded, and he gestured for me to follow. The floor creaked beneath my feet as I was led to a table at the center of the room, illuminated by a single overhead light that cast sharp, angular shadows. The man disappeared without another word, leaving behind a menu bound in what felt disturbingly like leather, its cover embossed with the same jagged font as the sign outside. I opened it, only to find it entirely blank except for a single line of text: "Order what your soul craves most." My stomach twisted, not with hunger, but with unease. Yet I couldn't bring myself to leave. There was something oppressive in the air, a force that pinned me to the chair and compelled me to stay. Moments later, a plate appeared before me, though I hadn't called for a waiter. It was a simple dish, a piece of meat seared to perfection, its juices pooling tantalizingly on the porcelain plate, accompanied by a goblet of dark red wine that seemed to shimmer unnaturally. The hunger in my stomach flared to an unbearable intensity, overriding my apprehension. I took a bite, and the taste was indescribable, a symphony of flavors that seemed to evoke every joyous memory I had ever experienced, a burst of euphoria that brought tears to my eyes. But as the initial ecstasy faded, I noticed a faint metallic aftertaste, like blood, and the room around me seemed to shift. The walls, once lined with peeling wallpaper, now writhed with dark, vein-like patterns, pulsating in time with my racing heartbeat. The dim bulbs overhead flickered erratically, casting the room into a strobe-like chaos where shadows seemed to move independently of their sources. I tried to stand, but my limbs felt leaden, my body rooted to the chair as if the act of eating had bound me to the place. The waiter returned, his face now grotesquely elongated, his grin stretching impossibly wide, revealing rows of teeth too sharp, too numerous. "You've started the feast," he intoned, his voice reverberating with an otherworldly timbre. "But it demands more." Before I could respond, the other tables filled, no longer empty but now occupied by figures cloaked in darkness, their features obscured save for their glowing eyes. which bore into me with an intensity that felt like a physical weight. Their collective gaze was unbearable, yet I couldn't look away. Another plate appeared before me, this one heaped with raw, glistening meat that seemed to twitch faintly as though it were still alive. My body acted against my will, my hands lifting the fork and knife to slice into the quivering flesh. Each bite sent a wave of revulsion through me, yet I couldn't stop. The food compelled me, each morsel stoking the ravenous hunger that now burned through me like an unquenchable fire. With every bite, the room grew darker, the walls closing in, the air thickening with an acrid stench that stung my eyes and choked my lungs. The diners around me began to move, their silhouettes rising from their seats and swaying in unison, their movements grotesquely synchronized as though controlled by an unseen puppeteer. The waiter stood behind me, his elongated shadow enveloping mine, his voice a hiss in my ear. "The feast is not for the living," he whispered, his breath icy against my neck. Panic surged through me, and I tried to scream, but no sound came out. My vision blurred, and the room dissolved into a swirling vortex of darkness and crimson light. When my sight returned, I was no longer in the restaurant but in a vast, cavernous hall, its walls lined with grotesque statues that seemed to weep blood. The tables stretched endlessly before me, laden with food that grew more abhorrent with each passing moment. Writhing tentacles, eyeballs that blinked as I stared, flesh that oozed black ichor. The diners were now fully visible, their forms twisted and monstrous, their faces split by mouths that opened impossibly wide to consume the horrors before them. And then I saw it, the source of the feast. At the far end of the table sat a figure cloaked in darkness, its presence a void that seemed to suck the very light from the room. It raised a hand, bony and skeletal, and pointed at me. The other diners froze, their grotesque faces turning toward me in unison, their mouths stretching into identical, nightmarish grins. The waiter appeared beside me, his grin now splitting his entire face in two, and placed one final dish before me. It was a mirror, its surface cracked and smeared with blood, reflecting my face. But it wasn't my face. It was a hollow, skeletal visage, the eyes sunken and lifeless, the mouth locked in a rictus grin. "The feast consumes all," the waiter said, his voice echoing as the room began to collapse inward, the darkness swallowing everything. The last thing I saw was my reflection in the mirror, grinning as the void claimed me. It was late, far past midnight, when I stumbled upon the restaurant. The name, The Hollow Feast, flickered ominously on the sign above the entrance, half of the letters burnt out, as though the place itself had been forgotten by time. The cold air bit at my skin as I pushed open the heavy wooden door, its hinges screeching as if to protest my presence. The inside was dimly lit, shadows stretching across the walls like twisted fingers, and the scent of something rich and pungent hung in the air, something that reminded me of wet earth and rotting meat. A faint hum of classical music drifted from somewhere deep inside the restaurant, though the source of it was impossible to locate. The walls were adorned with faded portraits of men and women dressed in old-fashioned clothing, their eyes hollow and unsettling, as if they watched me from every angle. There was no one at the front, no hostess or greeter, just an empty counter where someone, or something, might have once stood. I hesitated but then moved forward, my stomach growling louder than the whispering wind outside. The low murmur of distant voices echoed through the restaurant, but there was no sign of life, not a single soul to be seen. I sat down at an empty table in the center of the room, my eyes scanning the eerie surroundings. It was then that a waiter appeared seemingly from nowhere. He was tall, impossibly thin, with pale skin and dark, hollow eyes. His suit was pristine, black as coal, and his movements were unnaturally fluid, like a shadow slipping between worlds. "A seat for one?" he asked in a voice that was too soft, too smooth, like something velvet trying to drown you. I nodded, my throat tight. He smiled, a slow, unsettling stretch of lips that revealed too many teeth, too sharp, gleaming in the dim light. He gestured to the menu, though it was oddly blank, like the ink had been drained from it. "Order what your heart desires most," he said, his smile deepening. Something in his words felt wrong, like a subtle threat buried beneath the surface. But hunger gnawed at me, and I gave in, staring at the empty menu, willing something to appear. The waiter's smile faltered for a brief moment, and when I looked up, his eyes gleamed with something that sent a chill down my spine. "The special tonight is exquisite," he whispered, his voice dipping lower, as though the words were meant for only me. I shuddered, then looked away, trying to force the feeling of unease from my mind. A moment later, the waiter returned, placing a dish in front of me. It was a dark, glossy meat, the aroma overwhelming, rich and savory, but with an undercurrent that smelled almost metallic. The meat was sliced thinly, its texture smooth and delicate. I picked up my fork, hesitated for a moment, then took a bite. The taste exploded in my mouth. Rich, tangy, like something I couldn't place, like the best thing I had ever tasted, and yet wrong. I couldn't stop eating. Each bite was more intoxicating than the last, as if the food was calling me to devour it, to lose myself in it. The shadows in the room seemed to stretch longer, the dim light flickering as I ate, and slowly, my surroundings began to change. The walls seemed to warp, twisting like they were alive, breathing with an eerie rhythm. The portraits on the walls, those hollow-eyed figures, seemed to move, their eyes following me with a predatory gaze. And then, I noticed the other diners, their faces twisted in grotesque, silent contortions, their eyes black as night, their mouths gaping as they chewed with ravenous hunger, consuming their food with unnatural speed. It was then that I realized there was no escape. The food had taken hold of me, and I had become a part of this cursed feast. Panic surged in my chest, but as I looked around, my vision grew blurry, the edges of my consciousness slipping into something dark, something ancient. The room seemed to close in on me, the air thick with the heavy scent of decay. I stood, trying to flee, but my legs failed me, my body frozen in place, paralyzed by the overwhelming hunger that now consumed me. The waiter, his grin now monstrous, approached again. "You've tasted it now, haven't you?" he whispered. "The hunger that never ends, the feast that never finishes." His words cut through me like ice. I opened my mouth to scream, but no sound escaped, only a hollow rasp. The others around me were no better. They were all trapped, their eyes wide with the same realization that gripped me now. There was no leaving, no escape from the endless hunger that consumed us all. With each bite, I felt myself slipping further away from reality, the shadows around me thickening into something more sinister, something ancient that fed off the souls of those who dared enter. I was no longer a guest at this feast. I was part of it, a hollow vessel to be consumed, my soul slowly being devoured by the insatiable darkness that hungered for us all. The walls around me seemed to pulse with the rhythm of something breathing, something waiting to devour me whole. The faces of the other diners, if they could still be called that, melted into grotesque, misshapen masks, their once human features contorting into something monstrous. But I could not stop. I could not leave. The meat, that horrific, delicious meat, demanded that I eat, and eat I did. With every bite, my body grew colder, my thoughts more distant. I was becoming one with the feast, my identity slipping away as I gave into the madness of hunger. And then I saw it. At the far end of the room, at the head of the table, there sat a figure draped in tattered robes, its face obscured by shadows. It raised a hand, and the room fell silent. The waiter bowed deeply before the figure, his eyes gleaming with worship. "It's time," the figure whispered, its voice a low, guttural growl that reverberated through my very bones. The room shifted again, and I could feel the ground beneath me give way, the darkness swallowing everything. My last thoughts, as the feast claimed me, were not of escape, but of hunger, endless hunger, and the realization that I would never leave. This place, this hellish, cursed restaurant, would claim me forever. The hollow feast had claimed me, and I would be a part of it, forevermore. I wasn't supposed to be there. I didn't even want to be there. It was a night like any other when I stumbled across the place. It was hidden between two rundown buildings, the kind of spot you'd ignore if you weren't desperate. The sign above the door was old, rusted, and barely legible, but I could still make out the words, "The Last Supper." I didn't question it. I was starving, and when you're hungry enough, you'll eat anything, even at the strangest places. The air outside was damp, thick with the kind of humidity that clings to your skin and makes every breath feel heavier. But inside, it was cooler, almost too cold, like stepping into a place where time itself had frozen. The walls were covered in dark velvet curtains that barely let in the light. The low hum of a piano filled the air, though I never saw the instrument. My footsteps echoed across the floor as I walked to a lone table in the middle of the room. It was the only table, a long, rectangular thing set for one, covered with a pristine white cloth that looked so out of place in the otherwise dilapidated space. The floor creaked beneath my feet, and when I sat down, the chair groaned under my weight. A shiver crawled up my spine, but I brushed it off, focusing on the hunger gnawing at my insides. I didn't know how long I had been walking, but I hadn't seen any other restaurants for blocks. When I glanced around, there were no other diners, no other patrons. The only sign of life was the flicker of candlelight casting long, twisted shadows on the walls. Then, as if summoned by my thoughts, a figure appeared from the shadows. Tall, thin, dressed in a suit that was far too formal for this place. His face was pale, gaunt, with hollow eyes that seemed to look right through me. "Welcome to the Last Supper," he said, his voice a soft, unsettling whisper that seemed to vibrate in my skull. I didn't respond. The man didn't seem to expect an answer. Instead, he simply gestured for me to wait. I didn't argue. He left and reappeared moments later with a plate of food, placing it gently on the table. The aroma hit me instantly, and for a moment, I thought I might be dreaming. It was rich, savory, thick with spices I couldn't place, and as I gazed at the food before me, I realized something was off. The meat was dark, almost black, its texture unnervingly smooth. The plate was surrounded by small, delicate garnishes that looked like they belonged in a museum rather than on a dining table. My stomach growled again, louder this time, and I couldn't resist. The hunger was too overwhelming. I picked up my fork, hesitated for just a second, and then I took the first bite. The taste was unlike anything I had ever experienced. It was rich, overwhelming, an explosion of flavor that sent a rush of warmth through my veins. It was so good, too good, and yet there was something underneath it, something bitter, something wrong. But the hunger was so strong. I ate more, bite after bite, until I couldn't stop. It was like the food was made to feed a craving I didn't even know I had. But as I ate, I began to feel it. A strange heaviness, a pressure building in my chest, as if the food wasn't just nourishing me but consuming me from the inside. I tried to push away the growing dread, but it was impossible to ignore. The more I ate, the more the shadows around me seemed to deepen, the music growing louder, more discordant, like it was slowly twisting into something sinister. I could feel my body growing colder with every bite, my vision blurring at the edges. The waiter reappeared, standing silently beside me, watching with those hollow eyes. "You've tasted it now," he whispered, his voice barely audible. The hunger. I couldn't respond. I was too far gone. The food in front of me had become a void, a black hole that I couldn't escape, pulling me deeper and deeper with every passing second. My hands shook as I reached for more, but as my fingers touched the plate, I realized with a sickening jolt that the food had changed. The meat, once tender and rich, was now cold, its texture unnervingly rigid, like rubber. I froze, my heart pounding in my chest, as I stared at the food before me. It was no longer just food. It was something else, something alive. The air in the room grew thick, suffocating, and I realized the shadows were closing in on me, growing taller, taking shape, as if the room itself was alive. Figures began to emerge from the darkness, stepping out of the walls, their eyes glowing with the same hollow emptiness as the waiters. There were no words, no sounds, just the oppressive, suffocating presence of them all around me. And then the room seemed to shift. The walls groaned as if something vast and ancient was waking. The figures closed in, their faces twisted in grotesque smiles. One by one, they took their place at the table, their eyes fixed on me, their mouths agape, waiting for me to finish. But I couldn't stop. I couldn't escape. The food was now in my veins, coursing through my blood, and I was trapped, bound to the feast in a way I could not explain. The waiter was still there, watching me, smiling. "You are one of us now," he whispered. "The feast is eternal." Panic surged through me, but my body wouldn't respond. It was as though my muscles were no longer mine to control. My hands shook violently, but I couldn't stop eating. The hunger was all-consuming, the need to devour, to feast, until there was nothing left. The room, the figures, everything around me faded into a blur as I gave in completely, the endless hunger devouring me from the inside out. And then I saw it deep in the darkness at the far end of the table. The source of the hunger, the source of it all. A figure, draped in shadow, its eyes glowing red, its mouth open wide. It was waiting for me to join it. I was no longer in control. The feast had taken me, and I had become part of it, bound to this place, forever. There would be no escape, no release, just an endless cycle of hunger, of darkness, of the unrelenting pull of the Last Supper. And I, like all those who had come before me, would sit at this table for eternity, forever trapped in the feast, forever part of the darkness. The hunger would never end.